So good afternoon. I'm LaShawn Jefferson, the Deputy Director of Perry Rolled House, Penn's Hub for Global Engagement. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you from across the university and the Philadelphia community to our panel in honor of International Women's Day and Women's History Month, Grassroots Activism in an Era of Me Too. Before I get too far into my brief remarks, I want to acknowledge the co-sponsors of today's events, without whose support we would not have a panel. We have the great fortune of carrying out this program in partnership with the Alice Paul Center for Research on Gender, Sexuality, and Women, Penn's Women's Center, the Ortner Center on Violence and Abuse in Relationships, and the Latin American and Latino Studies program. Special thanks go to Hannah Anderson, who worked on behalf of the Alice Paul Center to make sure that today's panel happened without a hitch, and Ann Esakov, the Associate Director of the Alice Paul Center, who could not be here with us today, but who was an early and energetic advocate for this panel and launched us on a path that led us to now. We hold this panel at a moment of great hope and a remarkable series of public disclosures and allegations about the harassment and sexual violence that women face generally. From every corner of the earth, women are mobilizing to demand acknowledgement, to demand remedies, and to demand greater prevention. Women around the world have made enormous strides over the past 5 decades, entering the formal workplace, and in the process have contested and upended gender norms and male economic power. However, what we are so clearly seeing now is that whether a female is an actress in Hollywood, a musician in an orchestra, a dancer in a professional company, a waitress, hostess, or chef in a restaurant, a researcher at a university lab, a soldier in an army, an athlete in a national team, or an apprentice in a trade program, she is not safe from unwanted sexual attention, sexual harassment, and potentially sexual assault. While many elements within the Me Too movement are focusing right now on women in the workplace, the sexual harassment and violence that women experience in the workplace is a clear continuum of the sexual harassment and violence that women and girls face in many other aspects of their lives and has become normalized. One might ask, when are women and girls not at risk for and subject to the threat of sexual violence, when we have endless examples of how pervasive these attacks are, if you think about it? We would count women and girls harmed through child marriage, women and girls in the global south who are sexually assaulted while traveling to find potable water from wells or while collecting firewood or using public latrines. Rape and armed conflict is as common as guns. Women and girls experience catcalls and harassment in the streets and in public spaces in many cities. Women experience date rape, spousal rape, and stranger rape. They are groped on public transportation and are assaulted as they flee Central America for refuge in the United States. And women's bodies are objectified to sell products as varied as automobiles and household cleaning products. We should not misunderstand the context in which a global movement to stop sexual violence and harassment against women is occurring, or the solutions that will be needed to meaningfully change them. I would argue that nothing short of a revolution is happening, and will need to continue to happen if what we want is true transformation: cultural, legal, social, religious, sexual, and economic. On a broader front, this movement seeks to challenge the structures and cultural practices that objectify and sexualize girls and women, that subject girls and women to existing on men's terms. Yet, it will not be enough to attend to individual cases. If we do not dismantle the systems that put women and girls at risk in the first place, there will be an endless and unceasing tide of quote-unquote victims. Me Too began with Tara Burke, an American social activist and community organizer in 2006, with the recounting of her own experience with sexual assault and need for solidarity with other women and girls and their desire to heal. But there were antecedents before 2006. Vibrant grassroots organizing among low-wage workers in the restaurant sector, the Tambourine Army efforts in Jamaica, femicide movements across Latin America, cultural shifts and a focus on the human rights and agency of young girls and non-gender conforming youth of color, evolutions of laws and practices with regard to sexual violence, and in 1995, the Fourth World Conference on Women that happened in Beijing. Operating under this broad umbrella is a vast array of academics, activists, practitioners, grassroots organizers using this moment to contest male privilege and affirm women's and girls' full humanity, their rights, and their dignity. This work seeks to expose the power imbalances and structures of dominance, typically gender-based, that perpetuate sexualized violence against girls and women and blame them for their own abuse, silence and punishing them when they come forward. You'll be challenged with this panel to connect the dots across race, class, sexual orientation, and gender identity, to think how women are alike and how they are different, and how those differences contribute to their being targets of sexual harassment and sexual violence, and the justice they may or may not receive. So prepare yourself for a provocative and informative conversation with some of the best minds and the best activists working on this critical issue. In your chairs, I hope you had, or that you picked up on the way in, full bios. But on your far right, you have Joanne Smith, who is the Executive Director and CEO of Girls for Gender Justice, Veronica Avila, who is a campaign organizer with Rock United, Nadeen Smith, who works, Spence, pardon me, who works on several campaigns in Jamaica on anti-violence, and Veronica Gago, who is an activist and academic from Argentina. And we are extraordinarily fortunate to have the panel moderated by Deborah Thomas. And when she's not here, I refer to her as the triple threat, and here's why. She is a professor in the Department of Anthropology, a core faculty member in gender, sexuality, and women's studies, holds a secondary appointment with the Graduate School of Education, and is a member of the graduate groups in English, Africana Studies, and the School of Social Policy and Practice. We will have the panel followed by 20 minutes or so, 15 or 20 minutes of Q&A, and I hope you will, I won't say enjoy, but I hope you will learn and participate. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thanks, LaShawn, for such a great framing statement. I think what's going to be really interesting about the discussion today is to think across the kinds of boundaries that we often construct when we're trying to think about what our issues are and how we frame them, how we formulate them, and to really plunge ourselves into thinking across some of the kinds of divides that can often hamper our movements. And I think to have evoked the UN conferences on women, I think is good to constantly reimagine the ways that people in a variety of contexts talking together will come to a better series of strategies and solutions than apart. And I think we have a tendency in this country to imagine that certain concerns, certain issues can be universalized. So I think today we will go some way towards continuing to debunk that notion. We have a variety of sectors and fields and national contexts being represented today. So I think I would like to start off the conversation just by learning a little bit of the scope of the work that our interlocutors are doing. So Joanne, I wonder if you could start us off, just talk a little bit about your organization and the main issues that you're dealing with, and then also where you find your strongest sources of support.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joanne Smith. I'm the founder and president of Girls for Gender Equity. And Girls for Gender Equity is a 17-year-old organization based in Brooklyn. We're a national organization that works to end gender-based violence, and not just gender-based violence from an interpersonal space, but also from an institutional space. We work with young people 11 to 24 years old, cis, trans, and gender nonconforming, young people of color, and we work with them by meeting them where they are on their youth development stage, so in after-school programming, in healing circles, as well as post-high school, during college, and also work with them to help elevate the voice that we know they have inside of them and the advocacy that they have inside of them, because we know that they have solutions and they are closest to the issues that they're experiencing and have solutions for those problems and for addressing the institutions that often impact them. And when I talk about institutions, I'm talking about obviously schools, homes, communities, foster care systems, juvenile justice system. Any institution that they have to react to or that reacts in their life oftentimes requires a shift, especially when we talk about young people of color and in particular Black girls. And so Girls for Gender Equity's work over the last 17 years has really been to shift the culture, to shift the language, to shift the narrative around how young people are seen and how they are valued in the world. And we've done that through programming, obviously, again, after school programming and civic engagement programming, working with the government and participatory governance to really elevate what it is that they're experiencing, but also allocate resources, name policy, name practices that will shift the conditions for their lives. And we did that in New York City, and that work yielded a $30 million commitment from the government, and then that work has been replicated in 8 other states. And so right now, I mean, many of you may not know, Tarana Burke, founder of Me Too Movement, was senior director at Girls for Gender Equity when Me Too went viral in 2017. So you can imagine, Me Too has gone viral, and she's in a staff meeting, and she's just like, oh my God, this is a moment. And for us in the movement, the gender-based violence movement, the women's rights movement, we knew, we were on the precipice of something huge, something that would shift the culture in ways that 30 years of advocacy, 30 years of VAWA could never, right? And so our work, has over, and I guess I'll get deeper into the work that has happened, not just at GGE, but nationally. So our work has really, had I should say, benefit, of having the vision of Tarana Burke at the core over the last year and a half, to really bring to life the vision she's always had for the Me Too movement. When you ask what kind of support we have gotten over the years, that's what you're asking?
Yeah, and I mean that comprehensively. There's the kinds of informal sorts of support that one might get from other organizations, but I also am interested in very nutsy-boltsy things like, where have you been able to get funding? Where have you been able to make some inroads into policy? I mean, I think the example you just gave in terms of getting funding from the government is quite stunning, actually.
Sure. So yes, we've had a mixed bag. We've been really fortunate and also unorthodox. As the founder, I started GGE at 25. I thought it was going to be an 18-month fellowship. I'm going to say to y'all now, apply for fellowships, try. If you have an idea, if you see the system isn't working, it's not working. Apply for something. It shifted the course of my life and generations to come in my family. And I know this to be true because I know, where I started at 25, and then now what my 25-year-old niece, has to work with in wanting to replicate an organization in Maryland like this because she has the awareness of this work. So we started with a fellowship, and it was very clear within 3 months that Girls for Gender Equity was needed, and that gender and racial inequity was rampant in communities of color, in particular low-income communities with the obstacles around class mobility, and that the issues that girls of color, and we started with 7 to 12-year-olds. An 8-year-old girl, this is a trigger warning, on her way to school at 8 a.m. Was raped by a man wearing red contact lenses. And this baby was able to leave ground zero, the roof of where she was raped, and get all the way to school with not one human being stopping her, seeing her, asking her, is she okay? And it wasn't until she got to school that her teacher saw her and grabbed her and she passed out in her arms that she was seen. And we know a dog in the street, an animal in the street right now would get stopped and helped. And so it was clear to us as a community it was clear to us as Black women who saw ourselves in that little 8-year-old girl that this was going to be lifelong work, and this was going to be work that we needed to do not only in our community, but also to address the issues that impact our communities that don't allow an 8-year-old baby to be seen as a human, but allow her to be seen as prey. And so we were able to get support from, obviously, foundations, communities. Because of the needs assessment that we would do, we would connect with community groups from schools, people like crossing guards. Like the average community member was able to find a space in our organization and see their value within that space. We get, obviously, funding from Novo Foundation, government funding I just talked about, from the city, from the state, and then, of course, do fundraisers. We also get a lot of support over the years from Anita Hill. We were in her documentary in 2011, and our work around sexual harassment in schools was just tasked as the work of the next generation, Melissa Harris Perry. So a lot of support from other Black women who could see, right, that while they were trailblazers, there were young people who were doing this work right now that needed a platform and gave us then those opportunities.
And what's interesting about what you're saying, or one of the things that's interesting about what you're saying, is sort of moving back and forth with different levels of scale.
That's right.
And I think that must be the case for you as well, Veronica, with having a national organization, but you're working very locally. Can you talk a little bit about what you've been doing with ROC?
Yeah, so I work with the Restaurant Opportunity Centers United. ROC United is a restaurant worker center that organizes, it's multi-stakeholder. So the bread and butter of our membership are restaurant workers, but we also work with employers that are trying to enact what we call a high road to profitability, that are really seeing that worker prosperity and employer prosperity are symbiotic. And we also work a lot with consumers. And the overall goal of the work is to improve restaurant industry workplace conditions. And this takes a number of forms. But our largest campaign has been what we call One Fair Wage, and I'll explain that in a second. But to provide a little bit of context and why we organize in the restaurant industry, restaurant work and restaurants are disparate, they're disaggregate, so it's really hard sometimes to organize, it's really hard sometimes to build some sort of density of support. So we are working to do that, and partly because the restaurant industry is one of the largest and fastest growing private sector employers in the country. It's a workforce that's largely women, and it's a workforce that also employs, that has some of the lowest paid occupations in the country. So pretty consistently in the US, 5 out of the 10 lowest paying jobs show up as being in the restaurant industry, and a significant portion of those jobs also show up as being tipped occupations. One fact is that the industry comprises, there are a lot of tip workers in the restaurant industry, and essentially what that means is that the employer is allowed to pay this segment of workers a lower cash rate. Raise your hand if you've ever worked in the restaurant industry. Okay, so you're familiar. So we see that federally, employers are required to only pay tip workers $2.13. So there are about 23 states that have this as their base wage. And that figure hasn't gone up since 1991. Raise your hand if you were born after 1991. Right, so the sort of the frozen wage has been around for even longer than your own lives. In Pennsylvania, that figure is also quite low. It's $2.83. That's the cash wage that employers are obligated to pay workers. So that does mean that the majority of income that workers expect are based on tips. So because women are the majority of tip workers, we know that the wage dynamic creates an opportunity to have different actors abuse power. So a way to understand it is that it's a triangulated relationship. You have employers that provide the worker the opportunity to work and earn tips, because that's how people make their income. You have consumers that you're trying to please, because they're the ones that are effectively paying your take-home pay. And then you have to rely on the entire staff to give you the conditions to create prosperity, to create an experience that's going to allow you to receive a tip. So there are three actors that, this makes it a position that's very vulnerable to abuse. And that, then it's really no surprise that the restaurant industry is actually the sector that year after year after year has the highest sexual harassment claims filed in the EEOC. And it's really no surprise that the wage dynamic really lends itself to have women have to tolerate conditions that they would normally find unacceptable. And that's also a trigger warning. You know, there's a member in New York, Marissa, who recounted her story, and she shared that it was her first industry job. She was really excited, and that, you know, as initiation, one of her coworkers in the kitchen told her, you know, every day I'm going to tell you a dirty joke or some sexual story to get you used to the environment here. And so she was a tip worker. You know, tips are unpredictable. She had no idea how much she was going to take home in a day, in a week. But the only thing she could count on was that every night that cook would whisper some sort of sexual joke or story in her ear, and that's the only thing she could depend on every day that she showed up to work. And so, you know, what could she do, right? She wanted the job. She didn't want to cause any waves. She also needed that cook to turn out that food quickly because that's what the customer wanted, right? Because the customer doesn't care that this person, well, they probably do if they knew, but, you know, the customer in that moment wants food fast, wants food warm, and if there are any issues with it, they're going to take it out on the tip. So we are working to change that dynamic. We're working to change the wage paradigm. We're working to phase in one fair wage for tip workers, so to gradually move people up so that they earn just the same minimum wage as everyone else, just the same minimum wage as everyone else. And we think that that will diffuse a power dynamic, this is also echoing, that will diffuse the power dynamic that will sort of embolden people to stand up against sexual harassment in the industry. It'll embolden people to address issues when they arise, and it'll also, I think, just, not have this be an industry where sexual harassment isn't as pervasive. And right now there are 7 states that do have what we call one fair wage, where there's no subminimum wage for tip workers. And we did a study in 2014 and found that in those states, workers experience half the instances of sexual harassment than in states with a subminimum wage. That doesn't mean, you know, sexual harassment is gone. Quite frankly, obviously it's a societal issue, but addressing that wage structure really does drop the instances of harassment. So that's, you know, the biggest thing that we're working on, and let alone all the other ways that the subminimum wage impacts women. Like, you know, tip workers are in poverty at higher rates than the general workforce. They access public support at higher rates than the general workforce. So we know that this wage dynamic is largely a gender justice issue. It's a women's issue because the bulk of this workforce are women. They're largely immigrant women, women of color, mothers. And, you know, we find our source of support through pretty untraditional and traditional actors. We obviously, restaurant workers are a part of the organization. We also have a large number of employers that work with us. There are about 770 employers in what we call a RAISE network that are working to pass one fair wage or to enact different practices to make, you know, the restaurant industry more equitable. We also work a lot with the gender justice community. Obviously, you know, we find that the tip minimum wage issue to be a gender justice issue. We work a lot with immigrant rights groups. So because of the composition of the workforce and who people are, it sort of lends itself to be, you know, have this be an organization that can align with the priorities of a bunch of groups. And I will say that Me Too also created a moment for us, right? Me Too created a moment to really address the pervasiveness of sexual harassment in the industry. And it created a moment, I think, for women in the industry to reflect and say that what I've experienced over and over every day shouldn't be a norm. So I think for us, it's been a really exciting, hard, trying moment of reflection. And so we're really trying to change a wage dynamic that perpetuates that.
Yeah, I think what your work also shows so clearly is the way that different forms of violence compound, right? And that we have to think about gender violence through all these various facets, not as additional, but as actually exponential, right? And I also appreciated what you said about standing up, you know, and what it takes to be able to support somebody to stand up. And I think that is instantiated also, Nadeen, by the Tambourine Army, and then some of the other work that you've been doing in Jamaica, which I know everybody would love to hear about.
Okay. So I started my work on campus at the University of the West Indies at Mona. And at the time, I managed an all-woman hall. And so automatically, all the incidents of sexual assault, sexual violence get told to me. But there was no formal structure, and still is no formal structure to address those issues. And one of the things I began to do was to be deliberate about the information I would share with the over 200 women who live on the hall that I manage. So I started to use a very feminist framework, talking to them about their rights, talking to them about sexual and reproductive health and rights, and trying to identify the gaps in the legislation in Jamaica and also in the leadership structure, the political leadership structure, and talking to the women about becoming activists and speaking up for their rights and also challenging the university authority and to not be silenced. I recognized that with the amount of the women I was seeing who were talking about sexual assault, about being abused as children, that there needed to be a greater conversation in Jamaica about what was happening to our girls. So we started an organization called I'm Glad I'm a Girl. And I'm Glad I'm a Girl was essentially focused on getting these university women to know their sexual and reproductive health and rights enough so that they could begin to visit schools across Jamaica, talk to young girls, 13 to 18, who were in puberty, about their sexual and reproductive health and rights. And so we started with a summer camp. We would have girls we've had up to 60 odd girls at a time, coming into the university, coming on campus, and I'd train the girls first in the summer, the young women on campus, to train the girls who were coming from across Jamaica about their sexual and reproductive health and rights. And I think by making women activists, I'm training over 20 odd activists who are going back when they graduate to different areas in Jamaica to also become aware of the fact that they need to go back to their communities, their organizations, and speak up for women and for girls. So that was how I started at UWI. Having started at UWI, I think I gained some national attention, and then people started to call, we want you to be a part of this, we want you to be a part of that. And so I got involved with an organization called We Change. We Change is a group of LGBT women, and We Change asked me to be a technical advisor, and we began to be involved in women's work. And I think We Change for me was a group that was bringing women together from different organizations. So there was this big day that we had when we went to one of Jamaica's inner city communities and had a photo shoot with women from the two political parties, with women from all sectors, the business sector. And it was just about getting women to visually see how powerful they were, who the women were, and to start creating connections and to start talking about sisterhood and to start saying, okay, so we have the power to begin to start thinking through these things if we wanted to. So we wanted to focus on sisterhood and on getting women to recognize that we could do something if we wanted to. So We Change had what we call this big photo shoot. Women all dressed in white, and it was a beautiful sight in Kingston to see all these women sitting down and having this conversation very informally about how, as women, we needed to change the dynamics for young women and for girls. Just a couple months after that, something happened that shook us to our core. We knew about it before, but it hadn't happened in such a dynamic way such that we would respond to it. And that was a pastor from my church, the Moravian church, was found he was raping a girl, 14-year-old girl. And the policemen actually caught him in the act. And the thing about it is he'd left the church synod. He told a lie at the church synod and went home early, and he was caught. He was literally caught in the act of having sex with this girl from one of Jamaica's poorest rural communities. And when he was arrested, of course, it created this big drama. I, too, became conflicted by it because you heard the whispers, you knew what was happening, but it was never formally addressed. And then those of us who had organized that photo shoot started to talk about the instances we knew of the clergy, of the church, of men generally, making victims of women by sexual assault, sexual harassment, raping women, and how they got away with it. And it led, of course, to a huge national conversation. And in the midst of that conversation, what struck us was that there was no attempt to hold the pastor accountable. What was happening is that we had his church family saying it was the devil, and we should pray for him, and he had fallen into sin. Then we had a woman, a principal of an all-girls school who went to court to shield him from the media, from the press. She's a principal of an all-girls school. And just the responses nationally started to cause concern. And then a group of women started to have a conversation about going to the church to say he's not the victim. He's a perpetrator. There's a girl whose life was totally ruined. And we subsequently learned that this was not the only person in the family he was doing it to. He had a sister who was 21 who had a child for him, and that there was another sister who was 17 who he had initiated at 13 as well. And there was another one who was to be the next one. So this was a man who had gone through the family almost. And so we decided to visit the church. And we did visit the church one early Sunday morning. We drove about 4 hours from Kingston to St. Elizabeth. And several things happened, and one of our members hit one of the pastors in his head with a tambourine. And that again drew national attention. Later on, 2 of other pastors charges were laid against them for raping a young woman at 15. That same pastor who was hit in the head. And then a group of us, 6 or 7 of us, got together and decided that we had to do something about what was happening in the church. That it was all good and well to talk about rape and sexual assault, but nobody was really talking about what was happening in our churches. And Jamaica is a very conservative Christian society. Nobody challenges the church in Jamaica. Now, the people who have tried to over the years have been Rastafari people. And we've kind of assigned them the role of cultural icons and not spiritual actors in any significant way. And so we decided to start the tambourine army. In the Jamaican Christian church, the tambourine is very much a disruption. There's the traditional colonial churches, the Anglican church, the Methodist church, the Moravian church. They don't normally reside in the tambourine. The tambourine is a very African introduction and a disruption to the staid way that the traditional English churches, I call them, worship, as opposed to the Afrocentric churches who use the drums and the tambourine and play music and are involved in spirits. And so the tambourine to us represented that disruption of that narrative that says all is right with Jamaica because all is right with the church and all is right with God. There needed to be that disruption. And so we had a huge march. It was labeled, apart from an anti-LGBT rights march by the church in Kingston, no other march drew the amount of people as this march did, and we called it the March 11 March, which was and we started at a church and ended in a space called Halfway Tree, which was essentially giving survivors the right to speak, and the only persons who spoke on that platform were survivors who spoke about the different ways they'd experienced violence and spoke about who the perpetrators, the people who had committed this violence against them.
Nadeen, let me pause you a minute, because one of the things you're raising is a thing that I think might be common to other contexts. And it's worth pointing out, too, that it's no small thing in a context like Jamaica to do education, popular education pedagogy around sexual reproduction, reproductive health, because these have been issues that activist organizations have distributed materials and have been lambasted for doing so. So you're speaking about the dominance of the church as a cultural factor. And I wonder if that's also something that you see in Argentina in the work that you're doing.
Yes. Well, in Argentina, the counter-offensive of the church against the feminist movement is really amazing, because Now? Ahora. Thanks. The counteroffensive in Argentina against the feminist movement is protagonized by the Catholic Church. So I was shocked when I was hearing you. I would like to talk a little bit about the feminist wave that is galvanized around the statement "ni una menos," not one less. It's a phrase that came from a Mexican poet. She was an activist against femicides in Ciudad Juárez. And we started in 2015 like a campaign to denounce femicides in Argentina, especially a murder of Chiara Páez, a girl of 14 years old that was brutally killed. And Ni una menos means in the beginning like a shout to say, stop to killing us. But rapidly it's become a social movement. So Ni una menos today is a collective, is a group, but especially important is a social and very wide movement. So I think this is important point. The movement started as a struggle against femicide, but we radicalize the movement. And I think that a key point of this radicalization has to do with the calling to strike, to a feminist strike. In October 2016, we called the first feminist national strike to denounce a new femicide. Is also a very cruel, brutal femicide of a girl of 15 years old. And this femicide was during, we as a collective, but also as a lot of different political organizations, were in a national meeting of women. That is a tradition in Argentina, very important, since 33 years till now. It's a very amazing, massive meeting. And when we know about that femicide, we feel injured, but we felt that we have to do something more. And the idea of the feminist strike, I think it was like a threshold to organize the anger, but also to go beyond the figure of victims, because all the time the media and the institutions want to put us or to confine us as pure victims. So I think this connection between strike and femicide is a real important thing for the movement, because I think that allows us to think what understanding of violence does the strike imply. And we started to connect different kinds of violence. Violence in workplaces, violence in schools, violence in streets, and of course, domestic violence, femicide. But I think that the whole movement want to reconceptualize sexual violence. Mm-hmm. And I think that we are doing that, pluralizing the definition of violence. And for us, it's also important to stop talking only about violence against women and femicide bodies, to connect with other forms of violence. We think that violence starts from femicide and sexual harassment and travesticides, but we are committed to how not to enclose ourselves in a sort of necropolitical accounting. So we are trying all the time to produce a popular pedagogy about how we can understand, connect, and link different kinds of violence. I think that this popular exercise in very different places, schools, neighborhood, communities, popular organizations, unions, are producing a new kind of diagnosis of violence. And I think this is what produced another kind of intelligibility of what we are calling violence against women and femicide bodies and queer people. I think that if we trace the modes of connection, we produce another meaning of this violence, because it visibilizes the machinery of exploitation and extraction of value that implies increasing thresholds of violence. I think that we have to connect and to produce in a new way the organic relationship between violence against women bodies and feminicide bodies with the accumulation of capital. And we see in a very concrete ways in each territory, in each forms of violence. So I think that this reconceptualization and these forms of pluralizing and connect violence is strategic for us, because also it is the kind of diagnosis of the feminist mapping of interconnections that allows us also to think collectively and elaborate in like a new common sense of what we are talking when we talk about violence. And I think that we have also to stress the different impacts of each of us in every different territory. I think this composition of different struggles of different territories is a key of the feminist movement nowadays. I think, for example, in Argentina, it's very important how we are producing proximity between very different struggles. For example, struggles women's in workplaces, students, but also indigenous communities that are fighting against the criminalization of their territories, but also the very important issue of free and legal abortion, and how we organize this map, and how we, I insist, develop this popular pedagogy to understand between us, among us, this new kind of offensive of capital accumulation against our bodies and our territories. I think this is the main issue and the main challenge that we are affronting.
Yeah, and how that history plays out differently in different places, right? And for different women, right? For differently situated women within a society. I would love to hear, you've talked a little about your strategies and your, the kinds of work that you're trying to do with different constituencies. And I know we want to open up for questions in not too long from now, but I would love to hear a little bit about what, I'm sure you could make a laundry list of this, but where you see your major points of resistance, like who and what kinds of institutions, individuals, processes is providing you with the most resistance to the work that you're doing, and then what would overcoming that resistance look like? Like, what would justice really look like in the different contexts in which you're working? And since you just spoke about capitalism, maybe you could take up on that, Veronica, a little bit with your...
So I would say that for us, our largest source of resistance is the National Restaurant Association and the subsequent state restaurant associations. We refer to the National Restaurant Association as the other NRA. Just as intense. So it's one of the largest, most powerful lobbies. Shortly after the Trump administration came in, they started a legal center to try to beat back worker victories or DOL recommendations. And so I think to understand the intensity of their resistance, it's good to reflect on the history of the work, though a short overview. Restaurant industry work has been in this cash nexus since the late 1800s. Tipped work really extends from a legacy of slavery. The first tipped occupations were the Pullman redcaps, train workers that were paid only in tips. The next wave of tip workers and cheap labor were women that were working in restaurants, and this is from the late 1800s. So the tip wage structure is really meant to uphold the norms of that time, and it's extended over centuries. And so when we think of changing the minimum wage, of phasing in higher wages for tip workers, it sounds like such a simple thing, right? But we're disrupting, Nadeen mentioned disruption a lot, like we're disrupting centuries of symbolic, physical, economic, sexual violence in the workplace. So we've seen really, really strong opposition from them. And I think because we are trying to promote this different pathway of accumulation of capital, we're still not challenging that, but we are trying to promote a different pathway to that. We've seen intense resistance from the Restaurant Association. And I can tell you a lot more about how that plays off, but they're right now the biggest opposition group. And they've been around almost as long as the restaurant industry has.
I'm glad you brought up the connections to slavery and the immediate post-slavery period in terms of the economic organization designed to really maintain those hierarchies, right? And that's something I'm sure you see in Jamaica as well.
Yeah, I think when you were talking about pedagogy, my PhD thesis now is on developing a form of way that women can engage education so that it becomes liberatory. I find that we still have the same ways of engaging citizens so that people still, I think, align with the idea that some of us are equal and some are not. There are some citizens that are more valuable than others, and some bodies that are more precious than others. And I think what we see in Jamaica, particularly working in a university, is that the male academic is celebrated and expected to be the person who people listen to. And if you challenge that, then you run afoul of the law. So it's still, for me, the maintenance of plantation structure in Jamaica as well. Just how women operate in that system to shut women down is important to note. That a lot of the times I find that the way our systems operate is how it uses one set of people against another. And the ways in which subordination works, the way in which lack of self-esteem work, or people needing validation, or not being introduced to ideas that really generate feelings of freedom in the self, and how people relate to authority is important as well. And so for me, the church is run by men, but it's peopled by women. And I don't know if I should say, if you ask about resistance, if it's the women or the church who are greatest resistance. And so right now we're doing work around decriminalizing abortion. And we went to the parliament a couple weeks ago. And the people who were in the parliament who were saying this can't happen were women of the Catholic Church and women of the churches across Jamaica. And so I think, I don't know how to explain it. It's very problematic as a feminist to talk about women being so much a part of the pushback.
And maintaining those hierarchies and structures.
And ensuring that the church stays in the position that it was in, with men as the dominant force, with particularly light-skinned brown men, white men as the dominant force that must be listened to. And so just a couple of weeks ago, we had Father Holong of the Catholic Church declaring that he would rather die than see abortion decriminalized, or that the committee reviewing the abortion is a Jamaican white man, Reverend Thwaites of the Catholic Church. And between them are these layers of dark-skinned women, so.
But it's those same, I think, hierarchies of value and the histories of those hierarchies that you're really trying to challenge.
Absolutely. I mean, to him, I say rest in peace. I mean, because it's what it has to be. And you can learn a lot from the United States, obviously, around women keeping hierarchies in place, having a predator in chief in office right now, right? For us, the resistance is, right, the federal government, the president. The resistance is the carceral nation where every single, again, institution is criminalized, especially when it comes to then monitoring Black and brown bodies. So when we think about sexual violence happening, let's say even, think about Betsy DeVos and the pushbacks against Title IX, making it so much harder. It's not like Title IX ever fully got its stride, right? Maybe in sports, but around sexual violence, never, right? And now making it so much harder for students to be able to report when the work should be about prevention, right? Mm-hmm. And then you get to college campuses as though sex and sexual violence starts then. And you can find a white boy who has sexually violated and raped a student and who gets then probation. But then you can get a Black woman who tries to enroll her child in a better school district because she's unemployed and not working, and wants her child at 6 years old to get a better education, who gets then 2 years in prison. So it's these gatekeepers who, one, we have to replace, and two, who then make it even harder to shift the culture that is able to then impact the people who are within those institutions and who unfortunately in many ways rely on those institutions. I mean, at Girls of Gender Equity, we're abolitionists and at the same time understand there's levels to it, right? That we don't want, to remove a system that we can't then have a viable option to replace, but we can work towards that horizon and that vision and do so holding the integrity of our values and what it is that we know we deserve and want to see, and the community accountability around that. And so I wanted to just bring it around to some of the justice and what justice would look like in that, and that would be kind of community accountability, transformative circles and processes where folks who are the survivors and who are victimized are able to say what it is that they want to see done. But then also folks who are perpetrators, because some people do need to have be behind bars, and some people are not going to stop and aren't going to be part of a transformative process, but then are able to get the help that they need while they then are incarcerated or while they're going through whatever treatment that they're going to. For us, and hearing it from survivors, that's what justice would look like.
And that echoes, I think, with the popular pedagogy that you're talking about, yep. Solutions coming from the inside out, the bottom up. Yes. Is that what or where are you finding your points of resistance, and how are you envisioning?
Yes, I think that in Argentina, this idea of Menos as a statement, as a virus, means to research in each different organization, in each different territory, what violence implies, and especially how we could produce justice. Mm-hmm. We are all the time trying to think beyond the denouncing of patriarchal and colonial and racist and institutional justice, but we have this idea of community accountability that she was talking about, and how we produce these situated procedures of justice. I think this is a very difficult challenge, because at the same time we don't have faith in a state or in an institutional solution, but we claim or we demand also to the institutions, but at the same time we are all the time trying to think beyond this state horizon or state solution. And I think that this is very important when we go beyond the idea of domestic violence as a ghetto of a certain definition of violence. When we start to connect femicidal violence, state violence, and market violence, we need to think how we produce other ways of life in our territories, in our spaces, in our struggles. And I think the movement is connecting all the time this public terrain, this meeting in the streets as a massive moment of encounter with an everyday struggle in each spaces. I think that is not disconnected, no? It's a more spectacular or massive moment and a more obscure or difficult on everyday. I think that the powerful of that feminist movement has to do with this capacity of disobedience in every day, in everywhere. and we are developing this, I think, this in a very practical sense.
Yeah. I mean, the difficult tension always is, working within the spaces that exist in order to transform them while still maintaining a vision of a different kind of space that you're trying to bring into being. And those are they're almost contradictory objectives, and yet they're both necessary at the same time. I think we wanted to open up for questions, and there are a couple or one mic coming through the audience. I know also as you're thinking about your questions that LaShawn wants to make sure that we also think about hope. What are the things that we can point to as moments of inspiration that sustain us as we continue the work that's going on. So who would like to? Jennifer.
Okay. First of all, thank you all so much. I really, really enjoyed hearing from all of you. I wanted to, I was thinking about what you were talking about, Veronica, and the kind of origin of the phrase of Ni Una Menos having to do with the feminicides in Juarez, and how there's been so much work done to expose the relationship between free trade zones and kind of the economic policies that have completely transformed places like the U.S.-Mexico border or the border with Guatemala and Mexico, and the really direct relationship to gendered violence in spaces like that. Or also all of that we've learned, and that people involved in immigration activism have known for a long time about the violence that people who are forced to migrate and women who are forced to migrate and trans persons who are forced to migrate face. And that's been a big part of what we've seen with, not just the violence in the kind of immigration detention centers in the southern US, but also along the whole way. So I wanted to ask a question about internationalism in these movements, and I know that that's been, as that pertains to understanding the conditions of, for example, immigrants and how important that is right now in the US, but also the international dimensions of feminism more generally, of Ni Una Menos specifically, and what you all have seen, kind of the possibilities for that, how that, the challenge for that, why that is important.
Yes, I think that this relationship between neoliberalism and gender violence is central and is part of this complex diagnosis that we are doing. And I think that Ciudad Juárez and the maquilas are for us the laboratory of this relationship. And I think that, for example, now the resistance in the maquilas of Tamaulipas for us, for example, is a very inspired also struggle and to connect, no? For example, what is happening in Mexico and what is happening in Argentina and what happened as resistance against the mega project of neo-extractivism in different parts of Latin America and the reprimarization of our economies, and how all this building of precarity has to do with women, and especially how the masculinity or the dignity historically associated to masculinity has to do with the wage, and like a kind of objective measure of the masculine authority. And now with unemployment and precarity, all these authority is falling, and they express their attempt to recompose their authority through domestic violence. So the relationship between domestic violence and precarity and employment is, for us, very, very direct. So we are talking about the implosion of homes, the implosion of different kind of historically places that we are used to relate with pacified and very kind spaces. So I think the gender violence map is a map of neoliberalism in our region, for example. And I think that in this sense, the internationalism of our feminists has to do with how we connect different struggles and how we recognize that each struggle has a very practical map of violences related to these neoliberal reforms, with this crisis of masculinities, this crisis of the patriarchy of wage, as Silvia Federici calls it, and how we try to also share vocabularies, experiences, images of struggle in different landscapes. For example, for us, it is very important the concept of body territory as a single word that the women for example, in Honduras started to use as a way to name the resistance against the neo-extractivism. I said, we are not only an individual body, our body are territories, and we are part of a collective territory, and we can dissociate or disentangle body and territory. So for us, for example, this concept is very important to think abortion not only as an individual right of the body as a property. It is, for example, it has to do abortion with a class discussion. Why the abortion is not free, how you could achieve an abortion if you have money, and if not, you are in very dangerous risk. So we try to connect all this kind of neoliberal crisis with this gender crisis, but especially I think that the internationalism is a point of view of how we connect the struggles and how we share a diagnosis of violence, and especially how we produce a political language to reconnect ourselves between different genealogies, different histories, and without falling apart differences, but composing it. I think this is my answer.
Is there another?
Hi, thank you so much. I was really encouraged by how you each are using your positions to advocate and for the protection of girls and women. I'm wondering if you have any particularly stellar examples of allies and how that's been done well.
Well, I think for us, and you spoke about internationalism, our allies have been Jamaicans in the diaspora. If you know, so Jamaicans who've left and who live outside of Jamaica, I think have been, for me, the people who have been best able to reflect what is happening to us, to say, okay, there's a way that you can internationalize the reality that seems so very local, and there's a way that we can lend support, or there's a way that we can do what we can by linking you up with people outside of Jamaica. I think, for me, if that would be an example of allyship, that's where it is. I think within the country, it's a lot more difficult because we're small, people know each other, and I think because the work of women's rights, it seemed to be so anti-church, people are afraid of going against their churches. So it has been outside of Jamaica that has come.
And
I'll just say, because this movement is so decentralized, we are at a different movement moment. We're at a point where you can see yourself and have to place yourself in a position of being an ally in the moment or for a lifetime. It doesn't have to be the big bang that ends all, right? That's not gonna happen in our lifetime, but that we are actively chipping away at it within the positions that we occupy, right? So that could look like you're walking to the subway, you see a girl being sexually harassed, walking on the street, you say, hey, were you in that class? You don't know her, right? But you interrupted something. Just the other day, we got a call from a parent whose 14-year-old was also sexually was raped in church, and it was by the pastor and then the deacon. And this woman is calling for us to, because the church has turned their back on her. The deacon has run and fled, and she's calling because only her and her husband are out there protesting. She doesn't care where allyship comes from, right? She needs us to show up. She needs us to be there, and we can figure it out as we go. We know the church should be responding to the church. We know that resources should be poured in and support should be happening. Her friend is her daughter's therapist right now. This community response of we're gonna wrap our arms around you and figure this out together is what allyship looks like. On the larger scheme, right, of course, just recently, Novo Foundation launched a commitment to, and they're an international foundation that is the #1 foundation, I believe, that funds gender-based violence work, not only in the US, but globally. And they just committed Me Too funding, not only for the US, but globally, and just launched that fund. I see LaShawn as being allyship, bringing us here in this moment to have this kind of narrative shift conversation and connecting this work. I see at times, even though, I'll fight them verbally as, city council folks and politicians, electeds, at times they act as allies, and at times they don't. And so there's an inside-outside game for when they don't. So I just name all that to say, it's nobody's coming to save, right? The celebrities that were able to lift this up so that 10 years later, Tarana Burke's vision could be actualized, too, are not coming to save us. That, within us, that allyship and that resilience and that pushback lives every single day, and every single day you have that chance to give what it is that you have the capacity to give, to be an ally, not only first to yourself, if you are a survivor of sexual violence, but then to your community and people that you know and love.
One of our untraditional allies, just because we're so focused on trying to pass one fair wage, we're industry specific, has really been employers. And it's been really, it goes against the grain, right? Why would I want to do away with this wage model that's been entrenched for centuries? But we really had employers standing up at the forefront and saying that phasing out or phasing in one fair wage is the right thing to do. And not just talking about it from an economic standpoint of like, oh, this improves retention, but like really getting at the values of the issue and like really pushing their peers in the industry to say, you have to believe in the values change, and then we should have a discussion on how can we make this happen. So it's been shocking. I mean, sometimes these fights, these one fair wage fights get so tense in DC. There was someone from like the opposition side that even got arrested for harassing someone that was in support of one fair wage. So you're really having folks that are on the capital accumulation side, right, that are standing at the forefront and saying the industry needs to make this change together. Like, I believe in this. I want to have a restaurant that reflects my values. I want to have a wage structure that reflects my values. So for us, it's been great. For the workers, it's been really powerful. And sometimes it's a bit shocking, but I think that it's hopeful that these different actors are getting involved, that are really seeing the historical inequities and really helping us push forward.
Alliance, Veronica?
Yes, I think that the alliance with women within unions is a very important space for us, because in the first moment, the men's union said, well, the feminist movement has not the power to call to a strike, of course. But different women within the unions, they started to push to reconceptualize the strike and to use the feminist movement force as a force to struggle against the patriarchal hierarchies within the union. So for us, it's a very important alliance. And for example, we are discussing with them and we present at Parliament a discussion against a neoliberal work reform that our government presented the last year with the pinkwashing schema of gender equality and work reform. And we confront them in the Parliament, and I think this kind of alliance is very important, but in Argentina also is very important the popular economies, all those that are not unionized, all those that work in neighborhoods, in the streets, in the fairs, in the informal economies, and how we think also this as the big economies in our cities, in our metropolis. So I think these popular economies organizations are very important. And also I think the student movement in the last year with the Green Tide is all these massive mobilizations reclaiming free abortion. I think that the most important component of this movement are the students, very young students. A new kind of generation has become activists with the Green Tide. And I think that this popular feminism that is called in Argentina these compounds of different organizational struggles is also intergenerational. So I think this is very amazing how we all the time are reconstructing our genealogies, and at the same time we are learning from the youngest of the movement.
How are we doing on time? Do we have time for a couple? Maybe 2 more questions. So let's take 2 more questions, and then people can respond as they see fit. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for the really informative and interesting panel. My question is about the representation of women in your project. So when discussing the kinds of violence that women face, we often see women being represented as either entirely in control, so they should just leave the jobs or partners that they don't like or that inflict violence on them, or that they are completely helpless and in need of this like paternalistic intervention. So I was just wondering how you guys as leaders of your own projects, seek to account for women's experiences on the ground, but at the same time remain optimistic for change. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, and let's take a second question.
Hello, thanks for the presentation. Do you receive any threats, including death threats?
Okay. Okay, let's take one more too. That might end us on a. Yeah, there was someone back there who was waiting. Yeah, there can be more
simple.
informal conversation.
So what can we do in terms of grassroots organizing to actually make a difference?
Okay, so we have, what about the media representations and other representations of women as either complete victim or totally powerful? In what ways have you yourself been directly affected negatively? Have there been death threats around the activism that you're doing? And then what can we do to support either your agencies and organizations' work or work more broadly? Anyone who wants to take some part, all, half?
Count for women's representation. I think there are several narratives about Jamaica. One is that Jamaica has the most managers of any country in the world, female managers. So with Jamaica has more women graduating from universities as other places, but our ratio is has gone from 80-odd to 13% men. And so Jamaica does have a population of women who are doing very well in some respects. So I think we can't fly with the idea that our women are disempowered at all. And so that's not the narrative that we work with. I think for me, the narrative I work with is how, even in the face of all of that, patriarchy still manages to try to undermine women in their most powerful self. And I think that's the tension all the time, because there are people who will say, you know, that's not true. There's one colleague that I have from my university who says there's no such thing as violence against women. There's no such thing. As a matter of fact, what we have now is men being marginalized. And so every day, the pushback for me working in the university is, you're here talking about women, there are only 13% of men here. We should be focusing now on our boys and on our men. And, you know, it's posed in such a way as to suggest that we've dealt with all the issues that women could ever have in Jamaica. Let's now move to rescuing our men. They're the ones in trouble. That's our narrative. So women are we're not just saying we have not reached substantive equality. We are talking about how do we say it's not a competition, one, that women are not a monolith, that even in the face of all that so-called empowerment, there are all these realities that we still need to address so that women can enjoy the fullness of their lives.
Anyone else want to take on any of those?
Yeah, I want to sort of speak to the threats and the hope one. So I would say that, you know, people that have been public figures in one fair wage fights have absolutely experienced harassment and threats. I haven't in a while, but I know that our president is constantly receiving threats. She's being, you know, linked to ISIS, or her social justice academy at Berkeley is being linked to ISIS. Her phone number was released. You know, there were threats of physical violence against her when we had hearings in New York, and we had to like hire someone to make sure that nothing happened to her. Some of our worker leaders have also been threatened, you know, from everything to people saying, we want to bring you down, to like someone being threatened so intensely that someone was arrested. So we're really fighting an intense effort to do away with something that can seem so reformist, right? Like, we just want to raise the wage, but we're really trying to do away with a century of like a wage structure that's entrenched in keeping women and people of color oppressed. That said, right, you know, Pennsylvania actually has a campaign to pass one fair wage, and I know students are so tied to economic justice issues, like groups like USES have been so pivotal in helping win worker rights. So here in this state directly, there's a chance to get involved with the local rock organization who's fighting to move the tip minimum wage from $2.83 to eventually have tip workers earn as much as everyone else. So there's a direct opportunity if you're interested. You can find me, and I'm happy to connect you with our local Pennsylvania chapter who can tell you more about getting involved.
And I'll say, part of your question is why we are doing work around narrative shift and also being inclusive of trans and gender nonconforming, non-binary folk, because that narrative is so pervasive around this being a women's issue, when we know it impacts trans and gender non-binary folks. We also know that when we do this work, right, so many times, you know, especially for the young folks we work with, and I say all the way up to 24, 25, who, let's say, decide to speak out, whether they testify, whether they speak out at school, whether one of our alums spoke at the Kavanaugh hearing, like directly following the hearing, there's still, you know, trauma that happens as a result of that, right? So it's being able to hold and create the conditions where folks can speak for themselves and advocate for themselves and build that advocacy strategy and leadership, but then also being able to be a soft landing space, right? Being able to be an organization that can, if not support them in all the ways that they need, then direct them to that support and have that ready for them. And so I hear you on, you know, the paternalistic way in which we talk about, I mean, that's always been, you know, since the beginning of time, and especially as an organization called Girls for Gender Equity. I mean, it's been for us just by entering the room with that name. It's like, one, I'm not a girl, and we're gonna keep girl until girl is no longer a bad word. So we're gonna sit at this table and have just as important of a conversation about this issue as you are. But two, I would say for joining, I don't know if you all know, but when Me Too went viral again, there was a clip of Tarana Burke speaking here, right here in Philadelphia at a rally. So I know there are local organizations that you can be a part of, but also I'm curious, and I guess the question is back, do you all have clubs here? How is it that you all are working here to address the Me Too movement in this movement moment?
And that's the key, isn't it, to all of the activism that you all are doing, and that's done more broadly. Is it's the think locally or think globally, act locally issue, right?
But I'm wondering, is there a club so that if they can say it out loud, somebody in the crowd can hear it, and maybe they would want to be a part of that?
I will say that the Alice Paul Center has undergraduate and graduate certificates in gender and sexuality, and you can enroll in that program. It's very easy, and they will train you to teach responsibly about these issues and to navigate them in your life. So that is always an option.
And to add to some of the initiatives, GAPSA, the Graduate Student Assembly, is working right now on rewriting how we understand sexual harassment to influence politics here at the university. So if you want to join that conversation, just talk to anyone at GAPSA. I'd be happy to talk to you.
Great.
I'm going to have to do an intervention here because, Peter, can you turn my mic on? Are you there? Can I borrow your... Oh, it's there, so great. I want to make sure we give our panel a warm round of applause, but before we do that, I wanted to make one quick observation and extend one quick invitation. It's been a remarkable panel with extraordinary moderation. The messages that you take away here are not just messages of hope in the most vacuous sense of the way that we often hear that words, but messages really of activism. One of them is about showing up, how we show up for one another. I did women's rights work in a formal way for a very long time, and one of the things I learned in doing my work is that once you leave that work, the work doesn't leave you. And whether you're like a named women's rights activist or funder or professor, show up for the people in your lives. Second message, you have more power than you think, actually. And both owning that power and exercising that power is kind of paramount. You're not waiting for anyone to give it to you. You actually already have that power, so figure out ways to deploy it. Self-interrogation. No one's perfect. We all have issues. We all have internalized racism, sexism, and colorism. If you're from anywhere in this world, you're probably experiencing colorism and sexism and lots of other isms. So interrogating ourselves and working on ourselves over time and facing the things we don't like about ourselves. And last but not least, really looking at the structures that subordinate women and make this type of violence and discrimination possible. Because we do exist in larger systems that in many ways, it would be inevitable violence that we're seeing against women and against girls. Why wouldn't you have this violence given the systems that we're actually existing in? But the invitation is that all of our panelists and our moderator will be available for a little bit right after this in our student lounge. We want to give the panel a round of applause and invite you for coffee and dessert.